Night fell fast in the summers. Bats swooped overhead, and the whine of hovering mosquitoes underscored the trilling of crickets hidden in the long grass bordering the clearing Sammy stood in. It was lit by torches, the naked flames flickering in the stiff breeze that tossed his short hair and raised gooseflesh on his arms. He shivered in spite of the clammy sweat gathering under his arms and trickling down his back. There was dead silence despite the crowd of people surrounding him. They stood mute and stock still, gazing ahead at the makeshift stage they'd tacked together. Their eyes were flinty in the glow of the firelight, their gazes empty. They barely looked human. Arash's eyes had been empty when he died, open and empty. Blood smeared across his face, dripping down his nose between his open eyes. It dried on his face, his clothes, and spread across the floor around him in a sticky puddle. Sammy would only see more blood tonight. He looked up, forcing himself to meet the eyes of the man kneeling before the crowd. His hands were bound behind him, the soft curly hair on his head wild and flecked with twigs and leaf bits. He'd been dragged by it by the collar of his shirt, by his bound arms as he twisted and thrashed. He'd fought as hard as he could. He wasn't fighting anymore. His father beckoned him and Sammy stepped forward, climbed the steps onto the stage. Arash's necklace hung heavy at his throat, burning his skin. His heart pounded, blood rushing in his ears. A knife was placed in his trembling hands. He knew what it was for. Arash had lain on the ground, clutching at a knife between his ribs. He coughed, blood spluttered from between his lips to dot his face. Tears had rolled out of the corners of his eyes. "Go," he choked out. "Don't look back. Wash the waves from me." Samir stood there, nothing but the taste of tears filling his mouth. "Please," his friend had said. And Sammy had left him there in a pool of blood and no comfort to offer him but his tears. "Kill him." The voice was low, his father's. He laid a hand on his son's shoulder, his fingers dug in hard. "I can't." Sammy's voice barely cracked a whisper. "But you have to. It's tradition," his father hissed. And it was true, the man had violated the covenants. He'd entered the community. He'd seen too much and he had to be put to death. It was custom for a boy to put a sinner to death. It made him a man. Rashad scoffed, called it barbaric. Maybe it was. But maybe if he cut the captive's throat, his death wouldn't be so painful. Maybe he wouldn't have to lie there, cold and alone as his lungs filled with blood. Maybe Sammy wouldn't have to listen to racking wet coughs that got weaker and weaker by the minute. Or maybe seeing the look in the man's eyes before he died would be enough to add his death to sleepless nights spent shaking in a corner, trying to wipe the blood from his hands, wondering who the nameless man had left behind to mourn him, who was searching for a man never to be found. His legs carried him forward until he was standing before the man. He looked down at him, and the man raised his head. His nose had swelled, bruises darkening around both eyes. They had been wide, panic-stricken just moments ago when he'd kicked and thrashed against the hands, dragging him towards what he must have known would be death. Now all hope had been bled from them. The man sat as though he could have been carved from stone. A resigned look had settled in his gaze, just like Arash's when he'd pressed the necklace into Sammy's hands. "Keep it. Take it with you. Take me with you when you go to wash the waves, he'd said. Arash had always hated the vast expanse of farmland that stretched out as far as the eyes could see. He hated seeing the bland carpet of undulating wheat fields and nothing else. He'd wanted to see the sea, watch the waves. He'd always said they'd go together. And Sammy knew he couldn't do it. He set his jaw, stepping behind the man as though to slit his throat. Then, as quickly as he could, he severed the rope behind his wrists. His father moved first, but he moved faster. The knife didn't go through a rib cage as easily as he'd thought. But Sammy thrust it in, almost relishing in the sound it made when he twisted it. But his father's eyes were what he couldn't tear his gaze away from. Eyes that were wide in shock as he sank to his knees, clutching uselessly at his shirt. Sammy pulled the knife from his chest and turned around. His father's body dropped with a thud behind him. The sound echoed in his ears. The sound of flesh on wood. The sound of Arash hitting the ground. His head impacting the ground. And his father standing there. His face twisted into a grimace. "I'm sorry," he said, his words utterly useless. The man's gaze met his. He knew they weren't going to survive. The crowd surged towards them. There were too many. "What's your name?" The man's voice was almost gentle, like it would have been smooth and kind if it hadn't been hoarse from screaming. "Sammy. Salman." The crowd moved closer and closer, agonizing slowly, walking as though they could walk forever. Sammy would die tonight. He clutched at the pendant resting on his chest. He was going to die, and there was no time. "Salman, what does the sea look like?" He didn't realize he'd asked until the words were already out. A bewildered look across the man's face, but he replied, It's beautiful. The waves look different every day. Sometimes they're grey and angry and capped with white foam. They crash on the shore again and again, and sometimes it's calm and looks like a sheet of rippled glass that stretches out for as far as you can see. That's when the golden sun looks like it's melting into it as it sets. Sammy closed his eyes. He nodded, searching for Arash one last time. For that fire in his eyes, he took a deep breath, and then he drove the knife into his own chest.